Hello, thank you for being in a new video. On this occasion, I have with me this laptop Thunderobot R16. Let's do a full review. Let's get started. The manufacturer of this laptop is called Quanta. I know it is not such a popular brand in the world of laptops, but the fact of not being a popular brand also makes their prices much more competitive and aggressive to be known. It is a very attractive option if you are a gamer or if you like video editing and want a very high power at a very competitive price. In this case, they are distributed through Mercado Libre in Mexico and have the model with 1 terabyte of solid-state storage and 16 gigabytes of RAM at a price of 24,571 pesos at the time of recording this video. This is approximately $1,400, although the prices here are not the same as over there. Remember that in Mexico taxes are included, and honestly in this price range it seems to me one of the most powerful we are going to find, considering that it has dedicated NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4060 laptop graphics. Although of course let me tell you throughout this video everything else about this computer so you can decide if it is what you are looking for or not. So let's start by physically looking at this computer, which is large in size, and of course being a gaming focused computer, don't think it's going to be very light. It has a weight of 2.5 kilos, it has a mostly plastic construction, although it doesn't feel simple to the touch. I like it overall because it's going to make the computer a little bit lighter, and in several areas of the computer you are going to appreciate this type of reliefs with some lines, some decorations. In this case, it also comes with the Thunderobot symbol with RGB LED light, but as you see, even in the corners it comes with some decorative reliefs. So it has several design touches that make it special, although this is the only addition in this gray color. But notice that on the back, in the area where the ports and other things are, it also has some highlights in red color, which in fact sometimes gives the appearance that they were RGB lights as well, but not. The computer has a thickness of 28 mm in the thickest area and 23 mm in the thinnest area. It is definitely not a computer that seeks to compete in an ultrabook segment, but note that it does have easy one-handed opening, and that is quite remarkable in this price range, although it obviously doesn't manage to open up to 180 degrees and its angle is not that wide. The top priority of this computer will be cooling, so it integrates 3 huge fans with 3 different speed intensities that we will see in a moment. It also comes with a nice relief to try to give it more air circulation. So you see that on one side it has a huge vent, on the back are the air vents, and on the other side also a huge vent. So ventilation is one of the top priorities on this computer, and it definitely plays very much to its advantage in the performance that we'll see later on. But before we talk about performance, let me show you the internal design, where it also comes with several lines of different reliefs around its entire body. In this case, the power button is also the Thunderobot logo, and when you turn it on, you will notice that it also has lighting, as I was saying that you find it on the back. By default it comes in blue, but through the control center you can change the color and change the effect. Note that this control center allows you to customize not only the color of the logo, but also to adjust whether you want a static effect or you want it to change in multiple colors. The logo of the inner part with the button is in orange color and we cannot customize it. Regarding the design of the internal part, note that it also has different reliefs in these areas that give an interesting touch to the design. It's a full keyboard, including also numeric keypad, so it makes very good use of the space, and of course it's backlit with RGB, and again through the control center you can determine how you want it to look with 3 different zones. You can customize the color and the effects. In fact, in this case, you can also customize depending on the profile you're in. If you're in office mode, it may look different than if you're in gaming mode or high performance mode. And in the case of other Thunderobot computers, it also allows you to customize the back, but in this case it does not incorporate these lights as we could see in other models, for example Thunderobot 0. By the way, the keyboard offers us of travel, so it is a considerably high keyboard that works well for gamers. The response is very good, although note that even the block shift button doesn't have any LED indicator, so you have to be aware of the current state of this button. The trackpad is inches or so it's a bit larger than what we generally see in this price range. Its placement is oriented a bit to the left, which I find a bit curious considering that we generally always use the mouse to the right. And in this case, it's a single trackpad. The click makes quite a bit of noise, although obviously you can also click with a single touch without having to press hard. But anyway, notice that it also supports the gesture to scroll the screen with 2 fingers or to zoom. So it does support the basic Windows navigation gestures, but it doesn't have some more advanced gestures specific to the manufacturer. Regarding the ports, on the left side we will find the USB-A port. It is 3.1 Gen 1 and offers power output, so you could charge any device connected to this port. We also have the hybrid headphone jack. It also functions as a microphone input. And on the back we find its power connector plus a USB-C port. In this case it also supports DisplayPort 1.1 with dedicated graphics, so you can connect an external monitor through this connector. And it also offers us power delivery charging of up to 140 watts. Supposedly it also supports 100 watts, although I personally haven't been able to test it. That is, I tried charging through this port, but it did not charge anything at all. Then we will find the HDMI 2.1 connector also with dedicated graphics. And finally we have the RJ45 connector, completely useful for those who want a gaming experience with the lowest possible latency. On the right side there are also 2 other USB connectors 3.1 Gen 1. What you won't find is an SD card reader, which would have been nice if you were looking for this computer for video editing. And while we're on the subject of connectivity, in this case it does support connecting to Wi-Fi 6 networks. Note that it reaches very high download speeds, as long as your router and provider are compatible with such speed. And in Bluetooth connectivity we will be offered version 5.2. I think it has sufficient stability, although it is not the latest. The screen will be of very good quality. Its size is 16 inches, so it really has a lot of space. Notice how it has an anti-reflective finish that somehow helps the content to be displayed without so many distractions. In this case, we don't have information regarding how much its maximum brightness is, but definitely that for indoor use it's going to be a good screen. I have no doubt about that. It's an IPS panel that gives us good color. It even has good viewing angles as well. Looking at the content from the side, you can see that it still has a good display. There is no significant reduction in brightness or color distortion, so we are going to find a considerably good quality. In this case, the screen has 188 pixels per inch, which for the distance at which one views content on a computer is a good thing. Texts look sharp enough, although this is not its specialty. Definitely, its specialty will be the refresh rate, as it reaches 240 Hz, so all movements will look ultra fluid. And this obviously in a gaming computer is extremely remarkable. It's a very good quality display with a very high refresh rate. As you can see, it supports HDR content playback as well, and having a considerably high resolution, you could also use a different scaling in Windows to make even more use of the space on this 16-inch screen, although obviously the elements will look considerably small. But definitely that overall it's a display that meets a very good quality, although it doesn't have any kind of special software as part of Thunderobot to optimize some settings. The sound will be emitted by these speakers that are on the bottom. They are single speakers. In this case, it could definitely turn out to be one of its weakest points, as even though it does have 2 speakers, they will actually have a very low bass presence. Fortunately, they are loud enough and have ample experience with stereo sound, but it's not such a quality sound. Let's listen to a small test, although remember that it is not the same to listen to it live. This computer includes 2 microphones very close to the camera area. Let's try them.
Esta es una prueba de audio grabada utilizando los micrófonos integrados de la computadora Thunderobot R16.
Obviously, they will be simple microphones. If you want to do streams, for example, you're obviously going to need a dedicated microphone. In fact, if you want to do streams, you're also going to need a dedicated camera, since the built-in camera is quite simple, offering us barely HD resolution. This would be the video quality that this camera is able to offer you. As you can see, it's a very closed camera, it's not wide. I need to stretch my arms to the maximum to have a wider angle, so it doesn't stand out too much in this sense. But for video calls, I think it does a good job. However, note that you do need to be in a well-lit environment to have a good quality, because otherwise much more noise will be present and you will lose definition. But I insist. that for video calls I think it has enough for you not to look bad. On the software side, there's not much to highlight as it comes with Windows 11 Home Edition. Fortunately, it does not come with bloatware, unlike more popular manufacturers that might include antivirus, VPN, and a lot of pre-installed things that are simply free trials and then they are charging you. In this case, the experience is much cleaner at the software level, having only what Microsoft offers out of the box. But they do include an application called Control Center, which will help us to control the performance of the computer. Note that in this case, when the computer is unplugged from the power, only the office mode is available. And in this case, we can more or less visualize the performance it will have, which will be very reduced in CPU and will increase the noise reduction. That is, the fans will remain fairly quiet in this environment. It also allows us to select the display mode if we want a discrete mode that consumes very little power, since it will not use the graphics card, or we want the hybrid mode. And finally, the section to control the LED lights. So it's a fairly limited and short suite of options. Let's plug in the computer so you can see how when you plug it in, it's going to immediately switch to the performance mode that we had previously selected. In this case, when it's plugged in, yes, we could switch between these different modes. And as you can see, they remember the brightness that it had the last time you used it. So it can get to have this change in performance. Obviously, if you select the high performance mode, it's going to make a lot more noise from the fans and it's going to consume a lot more power, so it's up to you as a user which profile you want to use. But this is the only thing it offers at the software level. It has no additional tools, so in this sense, the experience will be simple. In fact, in security it will also be a very simple experience, since it offers us neither fingerprint reader nor a camera compatible with Windows Hello, so you will depend entirely on your password or your PIN, which in any case is a secure experience, but it is not so comfortable. The battery is 60 watt-hours, it's a battery that's not very big and that's definitely going to be noticed, plus the processor is not that efficient and having dedicated graphics it could also consume a lot more power. So in this case I did a test. As you know, I use this application to give the maximum power to the processor constantly, and as I showed you, when unplugged from the power it uses office mode, so the CPU is quite limited, and when I run this application it doesn't get to use 100%, but it stays more or less at 55 or 50%. So it does its best to give you good battery life by limiting the power of the computer, but it was still the computer with the shortest battery life that I've tested recently. It gave me just an hour and a half of extreme use with the processor at the maximum that the office mode allowed me. Although the constant use of the processor is something uncommon, so I did another test, and playing YouTube videos in full HD with 50% brightness and volume gave me 3 hours and 20 minutes or so, which again confirms that the battery is one of the weak points of this computer. The space inside the computer is used more for the fans and there is little room left for the battery, so consider that it is going to give you few hours of portable use. Most of the time you will have to plug it into the mains. Speaking of which, the charger, as you can see, is quite large, although it is not exaggeratedly large as I have seen in other Thunderobot models, but I think it does use a good amount of space and it also weighs considerably. You can disconnect the power cord, but you can't disconnect the power cord to the computer. It gives us a 230 watt output, although obviously it is not an output that goes directly to charge the battery, but it can also give more power to the graphics card. Using this charger in 15 minutes, it recovered 21% of the power and the full charge was completed in 1 hour and 45 minutes. Although you know that at 90% and above, the charge starts to get much slower to try to take care of the battery. But speaking of that, at the software level, we didn't find any special mode to better protect the battery. We would love to have a charging lock option or direct transfer of power to the processor without going through the battery, since it is a computer that for maximum performance must be plugged in. But if you have it plugged in for a long time, you will also notice that the battery may deteriorate to the level that it is not able to retain power for a long time. So this aspect should be improved in future versions. And finally, let's talk about performance. Let me first tell you about the hardware components that it integrates, since in this case it has the Intel Core i7-1414650HX processor. In other words, it's not the most recent generation processor, but it's one of the most recent generations today. So it should offer very good power, but one of the main differences is that it will not integrate NPU, only CPU and GPU. Although you know that the GPU is actually going to be used for a very basic task, because this computer also has a dedicated GPU. We're talking about the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4060 laptop. So the performance should be very high in this kind of graphics intensive applications. It also comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a terabyte of solid state storage that has only one partition. It's worth noting to you that the RAM is LPDDR5 and the storage is M2 solid state, obviously. And even though it doesn't have some tray for quick access to RAM or solid state storage, it is possible to upgrade because the motherboard brings enough slots to go up to 48 gigabytes of RAM and 8 terabytes of solid state storage. So it's another important part of a laptop, because many laptops are not that easy to upgrade. But if you're more interested in Cinebench benchmarks in multi-core, plugged in with the high performance profile, it reached 11,675 points, and in single core 1,818. And unplugged from power with the office profile, it achieved 5,876 points in multi-core and 1,079 points in single core. And in a graphics benchmark, that is Furmark, with the Vulkan library, it achieved 9,121 points with 152 frames per second. Let's go now to our traditional application opening test. There are going to be 10 applications in total. We start a stopwatch and observe how little by little the applications can be opened with good speed. We are already opening PowerPoint, and now we come to the slightly more complex applications. But remember that in this case we have the high performance profile. Obviously in the office profile it can take much longer to open, but we are about to finish the test. In this case, it doesn't use the GPU, so it uses 100% CPU, and therefore we're not going to notice such incredible speed as what we might notice when processing graphical issues. So we are about to finish opening Adobe Premiere Pro, which would be the last of the applications. We're going to wait for it to finish opening completely before we finish it, and that's it, 4.4 seconds on average. Let's do this same test, but now with the computer unplugged from the power. Notice that it immediately switches to office mode, and therefore the performance will be much more limited. But let's demonstrate it anyway. We open again one by one the applications and wait. Obviously it is not necessary to wait for one application to open before opening the next one, but to make the test fairer, we are trying to wait. In the case of simple applications, it seems that there is not so much difference in the speed of opening, but probably in the more complex applications if we get to notice a little slower. In this case, we are waiting for Adobe Lightroom to finish opening with 2 photographs that are being displayed on the screen, and finally we start now to open Photoshop. Later we will open Adobe Premiere Pro, but it seems to me that the time is exceeding a lot compared to the time we had with the computer plugged to the power, so it still doesn't finish opening Adobe Photoshop, and I don't know what else to say, but I want the test to come out without cuts. It's about to exceed 1 minute, so as you can see the time practically doubles or even more than doubles when the computer is unplugged from the power. Now, it remains to open Adobe Premiere Pro, so I'm going to wait because I don't know what else to say, and I'll tell you how long it took in total. And it's already practically 8.9 seconds to open each application on average, considering these complex applications, so the time definitely multiplies when the computer is unplugged. Right now, the 16GB RAM is 83% utilized, so we're going to open up multiple tabs in our browser. And notice that when the computer is unplugged, it gets a little bit slow when it's loading all this stuff, so I'm going to plug it in. I think it's pretty clear that this is a computer that needs to be plugged in if you want to get maximum performance. So now that it's plugged in, we're going to wait for it to finish loading all this stuff, and finally we're going to see how the RAM is doing. Obviously you see that the computer starts to respond much faster when it's plugged in, and the RAM is at 93%. It's reaching its limit, but notice that when we're doing these kinds of tasks, it's using the GPU built into the processor, although, you know, in the control center you could force it to always use the dedicated GPU, which is going to raise your power consumption, but obviously it's also going to help with very high performance. So now we're going to open up several documents just so you can continue to see that the performance will obviously be positive in these types of scenarios with documents and with some applications. I don't think there's much more to say. You're looking at the performance that it's capable of. We haven't seen any white screens when we go back to a browser tab or an application. We are even going to open a Photoshop document. In this case, it's a document that has multiple layers. Then we will also see more or less how long it takes to open, and then I will open a photograph to run an analysis of its elements. Watch, it still doesn't finish opening the document, and finally we have it. Just so you can see how complex this document can be, it has 9 different folders, obviously with multiple layers within them. Let's move an image so you can see that once it has loaded the document, I think it can become quite fluent. In this case, there are several layers that are available, and it can take a little while the first time you choose an element, but after that I think it loads smoothly. Now let's open some independent photograph, and I'll select the object selection tool so you can see how long it takes to react and finally give me this adjustment. As you can see, I think it performs with good speed. Let's test now how long it takes to export a video of 1 minute duration in total with 4K in its resolution. In this case, the computer is plugged into the power, and you notice that interestingly it's using 100% of the integrated GPU, and the dedicated GPU is at 58% at this point, although it's slowly coming up. It seems to be relying on both GPUs until finally it is using by a peak 100% of the dedicated GPU. It seems to be curious, the performance that we're seeing on this one, and it's taking a little bit longer than I expected. It's just over 30 seconds, so the performance is quite curious. Obviously, it will also depend a lot on the application that we're using, but in this case it reached about 40 seconds, although it's taking a long time to close the file, but ultimately 40 seconds to export this video. I think it's not something so remarkable, but I have a feeling it's more due to the optimization that the application has, because it first used Intel's integrated graphics. But let's test the games. In Genshin Impact, for example, it defaults to a custom quality with 60 frames per second maximum. Several settings are on the high quality. We could possibly set it to very high, but let's play it with this default setting. And having the computer unplugged from the power, i.e. with the office profile, gives an average of 30 frames per second. Although if there are some brief cuts when playing, so it does not give the maximum fluidity, and that is evident because it is looking to have a low power consumption, and even so the battery will not perform much. So it is not recommended to play with the computer unplugged, but I wanted to do the test to more or less have a reference of the performance it can get when it is not plugged to the power. And still the experience is playable, although it is evident that you don't have as much fluidity as you should. On the other hand, when the computer is plugged to the power with the maximum performance profile, the experience is completely perfect. 60 frames per second, completely stable, not even a low peak. So really the experience when you are playing with this computer plugged to the power will be extremely good. In this case, even recording the screen did not have any complications, so very good in this regard. In the case of Fortnite, it is limited to 60 frames per second by default. And in terms of graphics, you are going to notice that there are some balanced settings, several things off, other things on epic, and other things on high. So you know that on computer a lot of times it varies too much, this parameter, but unplugged from the power you're going to notice that it gives us about 25 frames per second on average with the low peak at 9. So this game in particular, I think it's not recommended to have it with the computer unplugged because it's definitely not going to be a very smooth experience. If you're with a close-up panorama in the foreground, I think the experience can become smooth, but if there are too many distant elements in the scene, it's going to feel like a much slower experience. So it's not going to be as recommended to play with this computer unplugged, although in this case it reached a temperature of 42.2 degrees Celsius on this top of the keyboard, which confirms to us that it gets to have good cooling, or in this case, since it's not going to be able to use the fans at full power, it also limits the processor and graphics power a lot. But when we plug this computer into the power, it really gives a very good experience. 134 frames per second or so on average. In fact, there was a peak where it went up to 171 frames per second, showing excellent fluidity. The minimum peak was a mere 55 frames per second, which is still a pretty high number, and it was for a brief moment. The truth of the matter is that the experience is very good, almost always running at over 120 frames per second, although the temperature reached 47.6 degrees Celsius when we were recording the screen. Without screen recording, it was more or less at 43.5 degrees Celsius. So yes, screen recording does add a little bit of work, but it still maintains a pretty smooth experience even when recording the screen, or what would be the equivalent of doing a stream. So we have a good quality when we are playing, and that is definitely very satisfying in a device that is 100% focused on gaming. You should be sure that the experience that this computer is going to give you is going to be too good playing, in this case Fortnite, as long as the power is plugged in. We also play the football, and in this case the default quality is in high mode, so with this quality we played. Although in this case we went to see the custom setting just so you can see that everything is in high quality. And in this case, when unplugged from the power, it gives us an average of 27 frames per second, which yes would be a playable experience. It still looks fluid enough. It doesn't look like the game is having too much trouble running it. However, when there is some repetition and changes to some scenes where there are more blur effects and textures, is when this computer comes to suffer at the time of being unplugged, as in this case did come down to 18 frames per second in this type of specific scenes. That anyway, being a repetition does not affect so much your gameplay in this content, but you should know that it does not have the ultra fluid experience that we would like when it is unplugged. But on the contrary, when it is plugged in the maximum performance profile, the experience is extremely stable. Practically at the moment of playing, we could say that it keeps the 60 frames per second stable, and in replays it drops more or less to about 47 frames per second. But as you can see, it still gives a fluid image sensation. Recording the screen may be a little more choppy, but it is actually a device that is capable of giving you a high performance when playing these contents, which have scenarios with much more complex camera effects. Although in this case the screen recordings are made at 30 frames per second with the Xbox tool, maybe that's why it does not give you the feeling of ultra fluidity, but believe me, when you are playing with this computer, the experience is exaggeratedly fluid. Although unplugged, it had a temperature of 39.5 degrees Celsius more or less, and plugged in it got up to 48.4 degrees Celsius, so you can see that the game is really quite complex, but the fans do a very good job because it did not feel at some point that it lost performance. I also tested gears, and in this case you're seeing on screen all the graphics settings that this device had. As you can see, it has unlimited frame rate per second, and a lot of the settings are in ultra quality, a lot of things on as well, so it has very good capabilities to show you special effects. So the experience felt pretty stable, although obviously not as smooth as we would like, showing 60 frames per second or something like that, but it's nice that even unplugged from the power it achieved this good playability, so it may also depend a lot on the games and how they adapt depending on the power of the computer. In this case, the temperature was 39.9 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, having the computer plugged into the power, it reached about 83 frames per second on average, and also the experience was quite stable, really no cuts or something similar are perceived, and in this case the heating did not become exaggeratedly high, so it seems that within the games we tested this is not the most demanding, although it does exceed 60 frames per second. The temperature was 43.5 degrees Celsius. And finally I tested Forza Horizon, and as you can see there, it is showing on your screen the graphic quality that loads by default, although in this case we raised it up to 120 frames per second just to see if it was able to reach those figures. But as you can see, it has a lot of settings selected in ultra quality, others also selected in high quality, so it has a great graphic compatibility. With the computer unplugged, we appreciate very nice reflections, very nice graphics, the images look good, overall it gives us a smooth experience, although interestingly at the beginning of our test it seemed like it was struggling, but then it seems to have stabilized a little bit more at 50 frames per second, so we could say that the experience is good, even unplugged from the power, although as I say it will consume a lot of battery in this type of scenario, so it is not so recommended to play when the computer is unplugged from the power, although some games do have the ability to run smoothly. But when we plugged it into the power, the experience really went up a notch, since in this case it was able to give us 120 frames per second super smoothly and with great stability, only some low peak of 80 frames per second, which is still a lot of power. In this case, our game was about 7 minutes and reached the temperature of 46.4 degrees Celsius, and as you can see, the fans do a very good job, although it would be much better if the Xbox tool would allow us to record at a higher rate of frames per second just so you could have this same experience, because the videos, as I say, go at 30 frames per second, but the computer is able to reach 120 frames per second in this game, showing us an exaggeratedly high fluidity. So for the moment, this has been all regarding this Thunderobot R16. I hope you liked this video. If you did, you know you can tell us, and we'll see you next time.